Hello everyone, I, Deepanshu Singal, along with my colleague Vanshika SHAH, welcome you to Samvaad. Samvaad, as a student-run initiative of for New Economic Studies at OP Jindal University, is organized with a vision to have a more accessible and decentralized platform for students and young scholars to connect with distinguished scholars and thinkers for a critical reflection on existing social, political, and economic realities that are observable in the context to contemporary India and the rest of the developing world. All members of our core research team participate in the forum along with students and faculty members. The broader purpose of each Samvaad is to encourage a more informed process of a collective discussion, which helps in creating a process of ideation among students, enabling them to further push the envelope in research and pick up on new areas of study in and across social sciences. The title for our Samvaad or conversation today is India's QUADilemma, Managing the United States and China. We are honored to welcome Ambassador Nirupama Rao as our guest speaker and Professor Avinash Anil Godbole as our faculty moderator for our discussion today. Ambassador Rao is a retired Indian diplomat, foreign secretary, and ambassador. She joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1973. During her 4-decade-long diplomatic career, she held several important assignments. She was India's first woman spokesperson in the Ministry of External Affairs at New Delhi, the first woman High Commissioner from her country to Sri Lanka, and the first Indian woman ambassador to the People's Republic of China. She served as India's Foreign Secretary from 2009 to 2011. At the end of that term, she was appointed as India's ambassador to the United States, where she served for a term of 2 years from 2011 to 2013. On her retirement from active diplomatic service, Ambassador Rao entered the world of academics with an appointment as Meera and Bikram Gandhi Fellow at the India Initiative at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Ambassador Rao has continued to pursue her academic interests and taught an undergraduate seminar at Brown University titled India in the World in 2015 and 2016. She is also a fellow at Harvard from 1992 to 93, fellow at Brown University 2014 to 2016, Jawaharlal Nehru Fellow, and a recipient of degree of Doctors of Letters from Pondicherry University. She was conferred with the Vanita Ratna by the government of Kerala in 2016. She is currently a global fellow of the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., a counselor of the World Refugee Council, and a member on the board of US-India Business Council. Professor Godbole is an international relations professor and the assistant dean at OP Jindal Global University. Previously, he has been a research fellow at the ICWA and a research assistant at IDSA. He was a visiting Fox Fellow at the Macmillan Center at Yale in 2007 and 8. His doctoral thesis is on the political economy of China's environment, and his research interests are in the field of Chinese foreign policy, environment changes in China, minorities in China, domestic politics in China, China's Asia strategy, and India-China relations. He has written extensively on these subjects in academic and media publications. He has been part of India-China Think Tank Forum and has been involved in various other Track 1.5 and Track 2 events. He's also a visiting faculty at the Naval War College, Goa from June 2020. Thank you, Ambassador Rao and Professor Godbole, for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
In today's Samvaad session, we will discuss India's relations with the Quad, especially the United States in context to a growing China. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, is an informal strategic dialogue between the US, India, Japan, and Australia, initiated in 2007. The rebirth of Quad in 2017 to secure a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific invited several reactions from all over the world. Since then, Quad has acquired considerable momentum, and on 12th March 2021, the leaders of all the Quad countries met in a virtual summit, While there has been no direct inference to China, the Quad is perceived as being driven by uneasiness about the rise of China and the security threat it poses to the international order. In today's conversation, we will discuss how India navigates its precarious relations with a growing China and an unpredictable US. We will start by discussing India's rising tensions with China, followed by its role in the Quad, and lastly, discussing the Quad's overall impact on US-India relations. We will be beginning with a faculty to guest discussion, which will be followed by a Q&A session. To take the Samvaad forward, I would like to request Professor Godbole to take over from here on.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepanshu and Vanshika. Welcome, ma'am, to our forum. And I look forward to a productive engagement that will be useful not only for the students, but also for me in the days to come. So while we discuss on Quad, I want to begin the discussion by asking you about the recently held the centenary celebrations of the Chinese Communist Party and the overall Xi Jinping leadership in China. What did you make of the speech that Xi Jinping gave, especially the reference of breaking bones and skulls was anything but diplomatic? So what kind of power is China becoming in the days to come?
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Deepanshu and Vanshika. I'm extremely happy to be on this platform. Thank you for your warm words of introduction. Professor, to address your question, we have all witnessed the speech made by President Xi Jinping on the 1st of July on the Tiananmen rostrum, where Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China 70 years ago in 1949. Yes, exactly, where he proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, and also, of course, to commemorate, to celebrate, as they would say in China, the establishment of the Communist Party of China in Shanghai 100 years ago in 1921. That was a very different China, as you know. China struggling to establish its identity, find its equilibrium, under threat from Japan, moving into a period of intense conflict, both against an external aggressor and also a civil war, as the communists and the Kuomintang fought it out, as you know. Very, very eventful years were ahead of China in 1921. But if you look at the trajectory of the last 70 years since the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949, I think everyone in the world is quite amazed by that trajectory. The distance that China has covered, the development that it has been able to achieve. But through all this, it has been the star, you can call it such, the star of the Communist Party that has continued to shine and refuses to be shrouded, refuses to be eclipsed. And what you have been able to observe during the presidency, the general secretaryship of Xi Jinping, is that the party is trying to reinvent itself. The party is trying to, the key word is dominance. It wants to assert its dominance over the Chinese people to ensure that it is not threatened, its position is not threatened in any way, that all threats to internal security as well as external security are dealt with a heavy hand. It is a China that, unlike during the era of Deng Xiaoping, is no longer hiding its light under a bushel. It is ready to go out into the world and assert itself. One vocabulary and expression of that has been the wolf warrior diplomacy that you've seen, the way that Chinese diplomats, in a sense, are fulfilling the role that was prescribed for them by Premier Zhou Enlai in 1949, when he said, diplomats are People's Liberation Army soldiers in civilian uniform. I think that is the kind of vocabulary that is being used. But wolf warrior diplomacy is just one aspect of it. I think the more concerning manifestation of this new China that you see is the aggression and expansionism and the muscularity that is expressed in China's relations with the rest of the world, particularly with its neighbors, particularly with countries in the region. So when Xi Jinping said in his speech that anybody who tries to oppose China will, I think I'm just paraphrasing, will have their brains smashed against this great wall of steel, which is the Chinese people and the Chinese, the nation. He is basically signaling to the world this manifestation of this new China that has come to stay, that under his presidency and leadership, which, as you know, seems to be an indefinite, he's prescribed an indefinite term of power for himself, unlike in the previous patterns where, there was a very, very fixed systematic transition of power after every 10 years, very peaceful, but very, very predictable. Nothing is predictable about China today under Xi Jinping. And we as neighbors, and India, as you know, has a long land border with China, almost 4,000 kilometers. We have an unresolved territorial and boundary question with China. And we face China, we face a buildup of Chinese troops along our border, especially as you've seen in Ladakh. So we have to weigh these words of Xi Jinping with a great deal of deliberation and forethought and calculation for the future. How do we deal with this new China? Does it just mean forming new alliances, or call it partnerships, or a new concert or coalition of the willing that is able to resist China? Or what is, as an individual nation, what is going to be our strategy vis-a-vis China? These are the questions, I believe, that are posed to us at this time, at this inflection point, not only in Chinese history, but also in our own relationship with China.
Yes, exactly, ma'am. My next question I want to draw from this is on the India-China relations. And we are at 1 year plus of the Galwan crisis that happened in June last year. How do you see the origins of that Galwan crisis? That question everyone thinks about as to what did China want to achieve. And there are several different projections and perhaps conjectures as to what were Chinese objectives in doing what it did. So what is your opinion on that as to what did China want to achieve? And as a second part question of that, how do we move ahead from here? I'm not using the word move forward because that's a different process, but what do we do next to get things back in normal? And what is this normal going to be in India-China relations as well?
I think first and foremost, I think we as Indians have to accept, especially policymakers, have to accept the reality that to have amicable relations with China, or to think of how we can translate that term into real achievement, is going to be next to impossible, given what has happened in Galwan. Today, if you ask me to describe the relationship, I would say that it is extremely stressed and visibly strained. There's a lot of strain in the relationship, and it is an adversarial relationship today. Strategic cooperation, which we used to talk about between India and China, seems to be an illusory concept given these stresses and strains. And the focus, of course, is on Chinese expansionism along the line of actual control in Ladakh. You asked me how it would have happened. I think we've gone into that ad infinitum over the last year. Was it infrastructure? Is it new China's, this new masculinity and aggression that you see manifest in China when dealing with neighbors, all neighbors across the region, whether it's maritime disputes with Japanese, with the Filipinos, with Vietnam, the posture on Taiwan, the events in Hong Kong, and then of course, this expansionism along the land border with India. Is it just because of, is it a question of infrastructure? Has it got anything to do with the BRI and China's, building up assets and equities in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir? Does it have anything to do with the changes to Article 370? I mean, there are a number of reasons that could be adduced, and none of them are singularly responsible, I believe, for the situation you see. But you have to keep all this within the field of vision, I believe, when you think of possible causes. Now, the steady Chinese ingresses we have seen in Ladakh are a manifestation of an expansionist China, a China that is nibbling, a China that is encroaching. You know, Mao used the term when it came to India and our so-called forward policy before 1962, that we were like silkworms nibbling, like nibbling silkworms. Now, can you call China that nibbling silkworm? I think it is much more than that today. And also you see the insecurity and suspicion that China has been articulating about the new Indo-Pacific vision that has been spearheaded by the United States and the concept that we call the Quad. Now, has it got anything to do with our growing friendship and our seeing eye to eye with the United States on most global issues and the partnership that we have built up with the United States, particularly in the defense and security sphere? All these could be reasons that we could adduce. But the relationship with China seems to have literally hit a great wall today. The compass, what are the directions that we can set on this compass? That is the question. The last 30 years in the relationship, they followed a road paved with good intentions, I believe, but built on flimsy foundations and characterized by a lack of mutual trust and a lack of mutual sensitivity. And if there was one concrete achievement that you could have written into the history of this relationship for the last 3-4 decades, it was the maintenance of a relatively stable situation along the line of actual control and tying this to various agreements we had concluded for confidence building and peace and tranquility. But that structure has collapsed today. And the other thing second point we have to keep in mind is that the boundary question is really a territorial question, because there are huge territorial claims that each side has on the other. Ours in Ladakh and theirs in Arunachal Pradesh, just to cite the examples. So I think a problem also is that the boundary issue has escaped solution all these years, and it has become a harder and harder nut to crack as the years have gone by, and the power distances and the power asymmetries between India and China have only grown wider in this period. So you can well imagine, I mean, in 1960, when Zhou Enlai came to Delhi and offered a solution, a formula for a solution, it's a very different China that you're dealing with today. They are not prepared, and this is a very nationalistic China, and in a world of new communication and new information, and the connectivities within China, a very nationalist sounding population, and a leadership that is willing to whip up these sentiments. You're really going to see very little give on the Chinese side. Furthermore, Chinese moves in South Asia, our own neighborhood, the BRI, the CPEC, the attempts to checkmate India in international forums like the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the UN Security Council on the listing of terror organizations, for instance, from Pakistan, plus the assertiveness on the border, and combined with insecurity and hostility about better India-US relations. All these are warning signs of the trouble that we see today. And one thing you have to keep also in mind is that China is not a self-confident power, despite the fact that it is now the second largest economy. It is catching up with the United States. Its military strength has quadrupled many times. It's not a self-confident power. It's an insecure one. And it has also, in the traditional mold of thinking, never regarded external relations, that is, relations with outside countries, as a field of equals. It just doesn't transact relations between equals. It disburses patronage, it accumulates clients, and India, in fact, is one of the few countries that actually stands up to China in our region and across the spectrum, I think. So to answer your question about what should India do under these circumstances, given the enduring tensions that we have along the border with China, and they're not going away despite all the military commander level discussions we've had, the ministers have met, the lack of trust and the persistence of suspicion is what you see today when you, focus the microscope on the relationship. So we must be prepared for a very glacial atmosphere in relations with our largest neighbor for an indefinite period and prepare for hard times in the knowledge that there is no warmth on the horizon. So it won't do to be optimistic about this situation. So it will require strategic calculations that can set a clear direction for both our foreign and domestic policies for the next 2 decades. And this will have to cover the areas of defense, military posture, training, command structure, tri-services training and capabilities, planning, logistics. On the economic front, the policies of Atmanirbharta are well-intentioned. I mean, I'm not quarreling with the concept, but they have to be buttressed by technological renaissance, by scientific temper, by a spirit of innovation, educational improvements, particularly in our universities, as you well know, international collaboration and openness to the world, that openness of mind, you know, Atmanirbharta with that self-awareness, self-reliance with self-awareness, where our strengths lie, where our weaknesses lie. I think that's very important. We have to focus on the resilience of supply chains and emphasize the development of critical and emergent technologies, you know, expend resources and planning on that. There has to be a unifocal emphasis on development and on social policies that discourage division and rise above religious differences and inspire confidence also in the population, especially among the minorities. And in foreign policy, we have to understand that there is no non-alignment today. There is no picture-perfect strategic autonomy in this brutish situation we face with China. We should be rational. We have to be realist enough to understand where we need help. We need friends. We need partners. You know, call them allies. We may not do that. Various permutations and combinations of our external relations. So, in a sense, yes, you need a multipolar sequence of relationships and situational positions of power across the region, and our ability to relate to all of these and understand the strategy of dealing with each of these. But ultimately, it's a question of building our own strengths and capabilities. And there we need a clear sense of vision, a clear sense of direction, a clear sense of intent. That's where I talked of a compass.
Yes, ma'am. I really enjoyed listening to you speak on this question. In fact, this point that we are dealing with a powerful but insecure China requires a separate conversation of its own, because it has a lot of hidden consequences involved in that also. And in a sense, I think you have preempted my next question also. So 10 years ago, when we were talking of India's foreign policy and rise of China, etc., we had an optimistic picture in mind, as if India had more choices, more friends to choose from. But right now, as you're aware, that looks slightly difficult. Even Russia-India relations have been patchy up and down. In fact, just a couple of days ago, I read in Twitter that France is the new Russia as far as India is concerned, as with our defense and technology cooperation goes. So China's rise and the developments in the last few years, including COVID and including Galwan, has altered our foreign policy choices. And in that context, how do we look to maintain this balance between the West and the non-West, as so to speak, within the overall framework? And how do we convince the others of our choices, of how we are making those choices, especially the smaller countries in the neighborhood, our immediate neighborhood, who are once again highly engaged with China? So India's foreign policy choices and convincing the world about how India is doing.
I think post Galwan, this is precisely why we have gone into a closer relationship with Quad. At the same time, in South Asia, you've seen, although we have, I believe, made well-intentioned attempts to co-opt our South Asian neighbors into greater cooperation, for instance, in dealing with the pandemic. The relationship with Pakistan, however, continues to be, you know, a point of complexity, an area of great gulf and difference and an inability, I think, on both sides today to really move forward. It is one of the tragedies of our times, but that's not the subject of our discussion today. I think we have in South Asia, our focus, the lessons, if we have learned any from the current situation, is that we have to, in a sense, reinvent ourselves in South Asia. We have to develop a habit of looking at this region as an integrated region from the point of view of geography, from the point of view of history, from the point of view of the future also. And if countries in Europe have been able to give up all their differences from 100 years ago and cooperate within, the European Union, that vision should also be able to. We need to take the example of that vision and to see how we can translate a similar perspective as far as our region is concerned. And that's where connectivity, greater integration, really reaching out to our smaller neighbors, not seeking strict reciprocity, but at the same time safeguarding our own interests. I think there is a lot of work to be done in that direction. But let me focus on the Indo-Pacific, because that is the region in which we are situated today. That is our larger neighborhood. That is, as they say, the theater near us, and the movie has certainly come to that theater, and we have to understand what the implications of that is. So I think our reaching out to Quad in terms of our foreign policy outreach is very relevant, because the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue is a useful platform in which to create synergies with like-minded democracies in the Indo-Pacific region and to promote issue-based cooperation. As you know, the last summit after President Biden came to power, he held a summit-level meeting with the leaders of the other three Quad countries, Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Morrison, Prime Minister Suga. And they have now, for instance, you see that the dialogue in Quad is reaching out to new areas, whether it's vaccines, whether it's critical and emergent technologies, whether it's climate change. When Quad was first conceived in 2004, after the Boxing Day tsunami, it was a question of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief after the tsunami happened in our region. And, the Quad just literally rose from the ocean, as it were, at that time, and established an example, a paradigm for cooperation. So, the writing on the wall is very clear for a worldwide audience as far as Quad is concerned, because it is spurred on by China's own manifest insecurity about the Quad. The more China expresses that insecurity, the more there is focus on this organization. And the fact that it has arisen from this churning of the Indo-Pacific, which is caused by the ascendancy of China in a very muscular manner, and the impact on many strategic hotspots in the region, our own border with China being one of them. So the events at Galwan have made India less circumspect about our dealings with the Quad. So you saw the Malabar exercises last November. You saw these meetings, the 2+2 meetings, the summit level meetings, the new areas of cooperation. But I understand that membership of Quad cannot take away exponentially from India's border problems with China, which can only be solved by hard negotiation and defensive deterrence. But I think being in the Quad, relating to like-minded democracies in the region, and also our focus on ASEAN, our Act East policy, for instance, and also our Think West, as it's called, the Think West policy, has helped India develop a more multifocal approach to our security, especially in terms of the maritime environment, because the environment of the Indo-Pacific brings home to us that the land is connected to the sea. However much we may focus on land borders, we cannot ignore the maritime environment, and India enjoys very natural advantages in this sphere, which have received little attention traditionally, because our focus has always been on the land borders with China and Pakistan. what we want to see, and it's not just through Quad, would be a more inclusive and a rules-based international order, not defined by a Chinese definition, and to promote development, to promote multipolarity in the region. Somebody compared the architecture for the region that we would like to see as being similar to the architecture that you see in Southeast Asia. You know, houses are built on stilts. They are of various sizes, but they help their inhabitants keep safe. They are very attuned to the climate and environment of the region. So you need a definition of security for this region that is attuned to our needs, that is not imposed from outside, that is not imposed by one power seeking to lay down its own approach to security. And I'm talking of China in this case, its own approach to resolving territorial disputes. And it's throwing the rule book to the winds when it comes to asserting its interests.
Okay.
So I conclude by saying that the three pillars that we need in terms of our own policy is preparedness for the situation, very uncertain situation that lies ahead of us, strengthening partnerships with like-minded countries, and thirdly, promoting a more networked region. That's very important, I think.
Yes.
So sustainable development, transparency, using diplomatic instruments, bilateral relations, trilateral relations, quadrilaterals, multilateral, enhancing naval capability, interoperability, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, all these are very important.
So my next question was in fact relating to Southeast Asia, and the region as such seems a little, does seem to have a few, not little, more than a little, in fact, doubts about the Indo-Pacific idea and the Quad itself. So how do we reach out to them? That is my first question. Within that, and convincing them will also involve explaining to them the contours of the rules-based order, rules-based maritime order. So how would you define that for our students?
Yes, I think we have to pay special attention. The first point I'd like to make is that you have to pay special attention to Southeast Asia, to ASEAN, to the countries in ASEAN that we have always said constitute, that are central to this definition of the Indo-Pacific. Because that is really where India and China have traditionally interacted, met in history. And today, a lot of, the maritime disputes that you witness in the region rise out of East Asia and Southeast Asia. And when it comes to the ASEAN countries, the land-based countries and the sea-based countries have slightly different approaches. One must recognize the nuances in their approaches to China. Some countries which are lesser developed in ASEAN are very much, the recipients of Chinese inducements. You would say also perhaps the targets of Chinese coercion. If you look at Myanmar, if you look at Laos, you look at Cambodia. But then the position of Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia are all slightly different. But all of these countries have learned to practice what one Singaporean diplomat called very promiscuous diplomacy with China. They want to stand up to China, but at the same time, they want to deal with China because their economic networking with China is so strong. There are very large overseas Chinese communities in the region. And traditionally, it's a region that has been very, very networked with China. So to impose, our definitions of what the Chinese threat is, while we can articulate them and we can certainly bring them into our confidence, and I think that confidence level is very much there between these countries and India. But I believe that ASEAN should be the focus, the area on which we expend much more of our diplomatic resources and also our economic interaction with the region. It's unfortunate that we are not a part of our CEP any longer. But we must now chart a way forward. What is going to be our future interaction with ASEAN? How are we going to be able to bring them into the circle of enlightenment, as it were, about how we are dealing with China and why we have very legitimate concerns vis-a-vis China. Not that we want to see the Indo-Pacific turned into a theater of conflict. That is one point we need to reassure them about. I think we have to reassure them about this fact. We have to reassure them about the need for continued economic prosperity, growth, and development in the region. We have to reassure them about the fact that we want peaceful solutions to outstanding disputes. But that also, most importantly, that they need to be cognizant about this growing threat from China. What is going to happen in Taiwan, for instance? 2049 is the kind of end date which China has set for itself in terms of, bringing Taiwan back into this great fold, as they call it, of the Chinese nation. So what is the strategy going to be about that? But there, I think a lot of attention will be focused on how the US and China are going to transact their relationship. How are they going to manage the tensions? How are they going to, ensure an equilibrium that will not allow things to get out of hand? Somebody said it is better to practice strategic ambiguity during these times rather than to, lay it out there in plain sight about what you intend to do. So the ASEAN countries, I think, practice that strategic ambiguity, and there are some lessons to be learned from that.
Okay, I have two questions left before I hand it over to the students for their question. So first is, we are seeing the return of Europe as once again an Asian power in a new avatar, as supporters of Indo-Pacific and participants in various activities in the region. How does India benefit from that activism? That is that role of Europe is my first question.
I think, I think the answer is very, very clear. We've always welcomed a much closer partnership with Europe. Perhaps we did not pay as much attention as we should have over the last few years to that relationship. And, during the Brexit years, particularly, I think, it was an age of uncertainty and a lack of precise definition of what these relations should be. But I think the expression of renewed European EU interest, and especially countries like France, for instance, you mentioned earlier, and Britain also, looking at the Indo-Pacific, looking at closer relationships and greater engagement, I think should be welcome, because ultimately I think equilibrium is created and maintained and ensured by like-minded countries coming together and being able to provide public goods to the region where you need it, whether it's science, whether it's new technologies, whether it's innovation, whether it's maritime security, whether it's the definition of this new architecture for the region. Not that you want to create an Asian NATO. That's not the intention. The intention is not for war, for warmongering. It's not to promote more tensions. The intention is to provide that confidence and to provide that structure, that equilibrium that really is able to reduce the levels of tensions that you see in the region, and to also signal to China that, this new activity that it is, fostering and that it is promoting and that it is indulging in the region will meet a level of resistance, not belligerence, but a level of resistance that is going to be durable and will have to induce a change of behavior on China's part.
Right. So my last question in this segment is on the India-US defense relations. And I remember when President Obama came to India on the Republic Day, we had several landmark agreements, say on the aircraft carrier blueprints sharing or jet engines for India's aircraft development. And later on, some of these seem to have stalled for various reasons. Why do you think that happened? Or is there any progress that is happening that we don't know yet about?
Well, I'm as much in the dark as you are because I'm not privy to what is happening in policy-making circles in the government. But I think the general direction of India-US relations, even during the Trump administration, would suggest that these relations are built on very strong foundations today, whether it's security, whether it's defense, whether it's regional cooperation, economic business partnerships, and of course the people-to-people ties, which make for a very durable underpinning. So it's a resilient partnership. It may have faced some downs, but it's mostly seen ups in the last 15 years. And it's always bounced back. And the important thing to recognize is that relations have diversified and they've grown stronger. And under President Biden, who understands the field very well and who knows our leaders and who's been in India several times, I think there is a level now of reassurance, in the relationship that would suggest that you're going to see stronger growth in bilateral relations and also much closer interaction when it comes to the regional situation, especially dealing with China. I think that I would, place the pointers in that direction.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I request Deepanshu and Vanshika to take over for the students' questions.
Thank you so much, Professor and Ambassador. This was such an interesting discussion for us to hear. And there's so much that was spoken and there's so many aspects, and we hope we can sort of delve a little bit deeper in our questions that we say. So we will be moving on to the next section. We have a few student questions lined up, which along with me and Deepanshu were prepared by International Relations Cluster at Nickel and Dimed, particularly Karthike and Yashasvi. So my first question to you, Ambassador, is that given the second wave of the pandemic and how that has exposed the limitations of India's current state capacity and forced its neighbors to re-evaluate the nation's reliability as a regional powerhouse, especially after India's vaccine export ban that sort of questions its commitment to the Quad's vaccine initiative, do you believe that India can truly live up to the promises as a member of the Quad and counterweigh this growing influence of China?
Well, I think India can certainly, ride the storm, ride out of this storm. I'm quite confident of it. The first reason I say that is because the way COVID attacked us, this second wave attacked us, nobody could have predicted it. With the benefit of hindsight, we can always say that the government should have done this, we should have done that. Yes, I suppose one could say that we should have planned for better vaccine availability on the oxygen question. People suffered needlessly because of shortages. But, hindsight is always 20/20. And I think we should always look at it with that perspective. So I don't believe we should rush to very harsh judgments about what the government did or did not do. But as far as India's image in the world is concerned, yes, everybody was concerned about the way we suffered. For that matter, even the United States suffered so much last year because of the pandemic. You saw the way people, there were fatalities, hospitals were running out of beds, they really did not know how to cope. So we're all dealing with a virus about which we are beginning to know a little more, but still do not know enough. So I think we're all human ultimately in the last analysis. And I think that should be the sobering judgment that we should always have in mind when it comes to describing such situations. But in terms of where the Quad is and where India stands in the Quad, I don't think people, our friends and partners, are judging us just because the second COVID wave had happened and there was, relative chaos and confusion in the country. But that is something that people would understand given the nature of the pandemic that we're facing. I think it's more when you're looking at the Biden administration, particularly when you look at the emphasis on human rights, for instance. So I think it's on issues like Kashmir, on issues like attitude towards minorities. These are all issues I believe that that they tend to flag, whether it's in Congress or whether it's in the White House, particularly a Democratic White House. So in that sense, it's very different from the Trump years. We're going to be, but this also, even concerns like this are unlikely to be ventilated in public by the Americans, for instance. They would most likely be discussed behind closed doors during, diplomatic meetings and leadership level discussions. So there, I suppose, our ability to pick up those signals and to understand how to deal with them, I think that's where the dexterity would be called for. That is where the skill will be demanded of us. So to answer your question, within the Quad, I don't believe, India's standing is radically affected by what happened because of the second wave of COVID. Our defense capabilities, our natural strategic advantages, the stability of Indian democracy over the years, and the fact that we are not China. I think India stands there as a country, as a presence, as a bastion, which is so different from China. Despite all the warts, despite all, the areas that we still have to make improvement, I think the world sees India as an example of a country that has struggled along the way, but has remained stable, and that has improved in terms of the levels of the standards of living of its people, the eradication of poverty. The path we chose was very different from China, but I think there is a level of, durability and resilience in that path, I think, that the world sees.
Right, and maybe just bringing it to a bigger perspective of just the entire Quad, you did mention about the need of, so to call a multipolar or an alliance to deal with China initially, and you sort of touched upon this question, but I'd still like to ask that how much weight should one place on the Quad in advancing a free and an open Indo-Pacific? Can one truly trust it to curtail expansionist Chinese policies, or even with the differences in threat, considering the Quad countries and their differences in threat perception, risk tolerance, military capabilities, and strategic culture?
Well, I think, one shouldn't put all our eggs in the basket of just, being in the Quad and, doing our exercises with Quad countries and having summit meetings. I think, how are we going to translate all these intentions, good intentions, no doubt, into actual steps on the ground, implementation? Now, let's say infrastructure. We've been very critical of the BRI. We've been very critical of the Maritime Silk Road and the belt, the belt, the Eurasia, across Eurasia. So what is our answer to that? What are the alternatives that we can provide? How can we better advise the countries concerned about debt sustainability, about transparency, about good governance, and offer alternatives also? Can we put the money where the mouth is? Do we have the bandwidth to be able to withstand China and to neutralize China in these spheres? And those are the questions I think that we should focus on. What a cooperation that we do in, let's say, in new technologies, in supply chains, in offering countries in the region, countries in the region who are not part of Quad and who are the target of Chinese inducements today, we should be able to instill confidence in them about the alternatives that we can offer, we are prepared to offer, and that we are capable of offering. Otherwise, there will be a questioning. There will be a questioning of capabilities. So Quad, we miss. I don't think we should get into the a mantra chanting approach, Quad is out there, Quad is the answer, Quad is our nirvana. No, it's not. I mentioned about the land border problems we have with China. What is our strategy going to be? How are we going to deal with this problem? How are we going to deal with our problems with Pakistan? My own personal view is that India cannot achieve the level of greatness that it is meant to achieve, that it has the potential to achieve, unless it's able to solve our problems with our neighbors. And I'm not saying that the buck stops with India where that is concerned. Obviously, there are things our neighbors should do. There are things that Pakistan should do, things that China should do. But I think we should seriously focus on this. Otherwise, going on talking about what's happening about the line of actual control is not going to solve the situation. There's a larger problem underlying this. I think we need the vision and the courage and less risk aversion. We need that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Looking at, let's say, a perspective from India's perspective, if we look at the world and its growing apprehension towards China, India is seen as an alternative for Western investors to set up their manufacturing assemblies and shift operations. However, these investments nowadays are seeming to go to countries like Bangladesh or Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries like this. So what could be the possible reason for that?
Well, I think we should introspect much more within our own selves. I think we should indulge in less chest thumping about our own advantages and how the world is short-sighted in ignoring India. I don't think it works that way. I think we should always distance ourselves a little and gain and develop that range of vision and that perspective that is able to see how others see us also. And perhaps, we need to look at our investment policies. We need to create regulatory environments that are friendly to investors abroad. We need to review all that we've done since 1991, the ground covered, and where, we need to do much more to make our environment much more transparent, much more predictable, less bureaucratic, less rigid. We have to be able to look at so many things: infrastructure development, ease of doing business. And at the same time, we need to take decisions about the critical areas where we need to move ahead without delay, accelerate the pace, to bring in the innovation, the new technologies, the ideas, and the investment that we need to really induce growth at a level, at a pace that someday we can catch up with China. Because today the power asymmetry and the gap is so large and it is widening. I remember in 1988, when I accompanied Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to China, the level of our GDP and the Chinese GDP was more or less the same. And you see the gulf between us today. And I think that should make every Indian, every thinking Indian sit up and introspect and realize that there are miles to go really before we speak.
Right, Ambassador. And these conversations kind of bring me to my next question, which was about the triad of these India, US, and China relations that we see. So the US's approach to this triad of India, China, and US relations also appears to be very confusing to me as a student. On one hand, the US is trying to counter China through the Quad and the recent G7 and NATO meetings. And at the same time, it also has, bilateral shouting matches, as they were called, with China in Alaska earlier this year. So what can be interpreted by this dichotomy in the US's approach? Additionally, the US has always tried to deal with China by itself or with the help of Japan and its Western allies. So why is it that India is never considered to be the first option and always comes as an afterthought, so to say, to the US in tackling China?
First of all, we are not allies of the US. We are partners. Mr. Vajpayee, the Prime Minister Vajpayee used to say that we are natural allies, but we are not allies in the technical sense of the word with the US. Japan and Korea and the Philippines, these are all countries with which the Americans have had very close alliance-related relationships over the years. So I think we have to recognize that. The other thing is that, in India, we should stop whining. I think we have to, the whinometer has to be switched off, when we talk about the rest of the world. Why is so-and-so not paying attention to us? We are so great. We are so perfect. I think we have to understand that no nation is perfect, least of all India. We are not perfect. At the first point we have to realize is that, how do we perfect ourselves? Not that we are perfect, but how do we perfect ourselves? How do we better ourselves? I think that's very important, particularly for all of you, this new generation. You have to think differently. You have to question. You have to constantly rage against, as they say, at the dying of the night, as they say. You have to be able to express that and to say, why are we not there? Not because why are others not doing this to us? Why? What is it in us that has prevented others from getting closer? What is it that we need to do when it comes to threats of the nature that we face? I think there is reason to be satisfied about the pace and the progress of relations that we've had with the United States, the levels of trust that we have established, the ground we have covered in defense and security, particularly, things that the US would never have done with India a decade and a half ago. Today, the foundational agreements that we have, the intelligence sharing, the growing recognition of the need for interoperability. I think these are all very, very strong achievements. Our cooperation in multilateral fora, the support that India has received from the United States in counterterrorism. The nuclear deal, of course, is a shining example of the ground we have covered and the levels of trust that we have established. So I think we have to take stock of all the good work and the good achievements in India-US relations, and to clearly chart our trajectory forward. What are we going to do in trade? What are we going to do in investment, in technology? Now India, with its inbuilt inherent advantages in the numbers of STEM graduates that we turn out every year, our capabilities in new technologies, especially in information technologies, and the work. India is one place where you can hire 1,000 Hadoop programmers, you get off the plane, and in a week you can. So the level, that's where I think Quad countries should also be. Look at India, look at Bangalore, look at Pune, look at Hyderabad, look at Gurugram as new centers in the Indo-Pacific for the development of these new technologies, critical technologies, including in fields like defense. I think that is really a new area that we have to really induce greater focus on within the Quad. But these are our natural advantages. Let's strategize. You have always said information technology and our skills in information technology, that should have been declared a strategic sector long ago. When you look at cybersecurity today, look at the threats that our critical installations could come under if there is conflict with China. The Chinese are out definitely in this gray zone conflict, as it's called, to take the confrontation into new areas. And are we prepared for that?
Yes, ma'am. And Ambassador, my next question kind of brings me to the Quad and its perception of China per se. And so it's very clear that the Quad will resist mentioning China as an enemy for as long as possible. But however, at the same time, it is clear that it is kind of waiting for China to make some mistakes so that it can come forward and take the lead. What do you think is this red line for the Quad beyond which it will be open to engaging and taking action against China? And similarly, how does China interpret its own sort of red line? And will we see more of its wolf warrior diplomacy, as you mentioned at the beginning of our session, with respect to the Quad, or will we expect kind of it being on the lesser side?
See, first of all, I think, Deepanshu, you have to understand that Quad is not a NATO. It's not a military alliance. It's not that, we talk of interoperability, we do exercises together, we train together, there is greater exchange of information and leadership level contact, much more. The levels of confidence are so much greater. All that is very well. I think the red lines, one red line in the region is Taiwan. Now, now the Chinese are already showing heightened levels of belligerence when it comes to Taiwan, intruding into their airspace, the kind of drills that they're carrying around the island. So tomorrow, if, one red line for China is if Taiwan were to declare its independence. They very clearly said that's a red line, that they will attack, that they will move, they will be left with no alternative. So that's where strategic ambiguity comes in, and how do you maintain that level, promote Taiwanese interests, but at the same time ensure that we don't want to cross that red line where the Chinese, they unleash, their belligerence and their aggression against Taiwan, which will draw many other countries into the fray. I mean, who knows? Have you read that novel 2034 by Admiral Stavridis? I would highly recommend it. It's on Kindle. You can get it on Kindle. 2034. It talks of a scenario like that, war over Taiwan, or Chinese attacking an American aircraft carrier. What happens then? What is the role of India? I mean, it's a good. I mean, it's a fictional work, but I think it tells you, what the world would look like if these red lines were crossed. But I think for Quad, the concerns are very evident about the role of China in the region, the activities of China in the region, China's outlook towards the settlement of disputes in the region, and the signals that China has given for Hong Kong, especially for Hong Kong, and for Taiwan also, and the leadership of Xi Jinping. Clearly, that leadership, while he may be popular within China, the reaction to his speech on the 1st of July would suggest that, but his leadership has caused concern. I mean, the profile of his leadership and the policies that he has articulated and the actions that China has taken all across the region have caused concern, have raised levels of concern about China. So has Xi Jinping been good for China? I think the jury is still out.
Right. And Ambassador, like my last question from the perspective of the student on this topic was, looking forward to the next 5 to 10 years, what developments do you think will best define the success of the Quad?
The best developments would be if the Quad were to, as I said, be able to outline strategies for infrastructure development, for debt sustainability, for transparency of how to transact development assistance, for good governance, to provide that alternative model to what the Chinese are purveying. Because everybody is concerned about China, except for some of our neighbors in South Asia, I think, who feel just so that they can, can aggravate reactions from India, seem to want to be drawn closer into the Chinese embrace. And I don't know to what extent it will help them in the long run. But that shouldn't be a reason for India to, sit back and blame our smaller neighbors for all that is happening. I think, how have we fared? How have we performed in the region? I think that is really where the introspection is required. And I think a policy for reducing tensions, for building more connectivity, for inspiring greater confidence among our neighbors about India. I think these are all hard realities that we have to confront.
Right. And Ambassador, I think, I share this with my colleagues that we as growing the new generation, we are, really interested in this area of international relations and foreign policy and foreign services. So, Ambassador, I would like to borrow some anecdotes or some, interesting things from your experience and high points in your career that, we could use to motivate us and really pursue forward this career of international relations and foreign services.
Just adding to what Deepanshu said, I think even the fact that, you were the first female ambassador going to Sri Lanka, I think it itself has many more hurdles than it would have been for maybe a man. So could you also sort of briefly mention how that sort of worked in your career?
One question to answer, Deepanshu, about a career in diplomacy and the foreign service, and ultimately becoming an ambassador and flying the flag of your country and representing your country. Well, I'm a very biased person in that regard. I'm fully in favor of the choice of diplomacy as a full-time career for a young person. And why do I say that? It's in terms of the exposure to different environments. You have a ringside view of history as it happens, as it is being played out. You are able to develop your intellectual interests, and also because of the exposure to diverse environments, I think you become a much more well-rounded person. And I think that is a quality and a characteristic that can bring much benefit to your own country, because the more you know about the rest of the world, the more you have listened, the more you have observed, you are able also to teach your own country and to bring back those examples to your own country. You know, think of Japan during the Meiji Restoration. If you study Japanese history, Japan was closed to the world for centuries. And then after the Tokugawa shoguns opened the country, and then you had, you know, this whole upsurge of interest in the outside world and bringing back, you know, practices, technologies, and examples of progress from the world outside helped Japan. Of course, it moved Japan in perhaps the wrong direction because it became very expansionist. But Japan has learned its lessons from that also. But overall, I think that openness of mind that diplomacy does inculcate in you, I think that's very, very essential for India today. I think our enemy is insularity, looking inwards. And I think a career in diplomacy, you know, robs you of all illusions, you know, that India can afford to remain insular. India has to look outward. You know, I come from the south of India. I call myself a peninsular Indian. I come from peninsular India. And in peninsular India, when you look at its coastline, it's always been oriented towards the outside world. And you look at the progress our southern states have made, and the levels of development, and you know, just the openness. I think that's something the rest of India can also learn from. So diplomacy, I think it's a wonderful career. As a woman, I think women everywhere do face not only glass ceilings, but glass cliffs. As I said, you have to climb glass cliffs, learn that art of ascending despite the most difficult terrain. It's not easy, but I believe you need, of course, you need familial support. You need, you know, that awareness within yourself that you are capable of doing this, that you are as good as the men in the workplace, and that you can do even better than them. I think that confidence can be instilled upon in you by your upbringing, your family circumstances. But then once you're allowed to, they let go of you and you find your wings, you should just fly. I think you should fly, learn to fly against the wind also if it's necessary. But I think the climate for women is so much better today. I would say that in our foreign service particularly. And you had somebody like Ambassador Muttama in the 1970s. There's a wonderful book, I don't know if you've seen it, by Narayani Basu that has just come out. It's called, I think it's, the website is 52.in. Just hold on, I'll tell you. I have it here. I would suggest you read the book about Ambassador Muttama and how she struggled against all the difficulties and the prejudices within the foreign service that she was, it's 52.in. And if under 52.in, there is a title called Ambassador. And that's the story of Ambassador Muttama. So I always call Ambassador Muttama our Rosa Parks, you know, the story of Rosa Parks, because Rosa Parks sat, other women walked, and today Kamala Harris can run. So in the same way, because Ambassador Muttama sat and, you know, resisted the prejudice that she faced, women like us were able to walk, and younger diplomats are able to run today. So if you join the Foreign Service, you would definitely, run, because the climate is so much better. The levels of acceptance of women and the roles that they can perform and the responsibilities that they can be entrusted with are, it's so different. There's no comparison from what it was 30 years ago.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. That was really very motivating for all of us to hear. And I'm sure most of us will be motivated to join the Indian Foreign Service as we grow up through the graduate and undergraduate.
I do hope you do that, and I wish you every success.
Thank you, Ambassador.
I say in the Navy, fair winds and following seas. May you have fair winds and following seas.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It was a great pleasure to and Professor Godbole. This was a very enriching discussion, and thank you so much for taking out the time for doing this with us. And thank you to our listeners. Stay for more episodes and conversations on Samvaad. Until then, you can check out our previous episodes on our YouTube channel, the website, and Spotify. Look out for our social media handles and have a great day.